All right. Thank you very much. We will now start the panel discussion, which will run about an hour. We received quite a few questions that you had written down during the 3 keynote addresses, ranging all the way from points of clarification all the way to deeper questions that transcend the 3 presentations. I prefer that people actually ask questions. If we can get some energy and people ask the questions themselves, I think that would be much better. If there's lulls, I will pull out the questions. But for now, let me go ahead and open it up to the floor to see if anyone who has a question they'd like to ask directly.
I made the same question in a different story to the Professor Roger Goodman and Professor Takayama about your idea about the reference of the similar or the kind of surrounding society, the society surrounding Japan, or the kind of neighboring country of Japan. And maybe I personally refer the much more East Asia or the Southeast Asia as a reference group, but maybe it is not really, it doesn't have to be limited to that types of the countries. My point is that, for example, when last week I was in Nairobi in Kenya and the Bangkok and then we had a discussion about Pan-African University. I mean that the African the research initiative collaborate with China, Japan, and Germany, and also we also had a discussion in Bangkok about how to really find the internationalization of higher education from the East Asian or the Southeast Asian point of view together. And there, I think it is not that elegant or not that straightforward theoretically as Professor Takayama made in a very, very elegant manner. But there is some kind of a movement that Japan could be a part of such a much larger movement to redefine the view of what's going on. In my case, higher education, but maybe it can be widely applied to education. So this is not always because of the theoretical excellency, but much more based on just the changing power balance of the society background. So obviously the Asia and Africa is now rising than before. So the one question to the Professor Takayama is that could I ask you to elaborate more about your idea of the post-colonial thing, so that you didn't mention so much about what does it mean and what does it mean for Japan and the other country. And Professor Roger Goodman, I'd like to ask that from your experiences as the professor of the University of Oxford, that you have many student researchers gathering from all over the world to the St. Anthony's College, and then you have lots of opportunity to compare or the talk with the other types of local the researchers with of the research on the locality or something like that. So I'd like to know that how what would be the kind of the next pathway to energize the Japanese the research from Japan in the field of education.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So let me start by saying I really enjoyed Keita's talk. I was just thinking of my own background. So you were talking about core periphery, colonialist peripheral, northern, southern. I think that's me. I should imagine that on one level, the University of Oxford is about as core, colonialist and northern as it's possible to get. I would have thought that the social sciences division in Oxford would probably be a prime example, except for one thing. More than 50% of the professors in Oxford are not from the UK. Most of them are coming from outside the UK. Many of them are coming from China and Japan, as well as from Asia, all other countries in Asia and Africa. I'm not quite sure what these boundaries mean. I mean, I think we're living in a very, some of us are living in a very post-colonial world. And if there's one big distinction, possibly between UK research intensives and Japanese research intensives, it's the internationalization of UK research-intensive universities. As I say, 72% of the graduate students in Oxford are from outside the UK. I think it's 55% of the academics. And that's why one of the things I'm really excited about in Japan is the internationalization that is beginning to take place. Particularly, I think, congratulations to Kyoto University for turning its Hakubi project into a genuine international project, and people like Jeremy and Keita and so on coming here, because that isn't happening at all the Japanese universities at the minute, as many of you will be aware. So I think a little bit question, how easy it is to make those distinctions. And as you pointed out, Kariya Sensei moved from Todai to Oxford, and he's very interested in looking at these different models. But back to the question, of course, you have to see Japan in a broader context. So every project I've ever done in Japan, I have always then gone and done a comparative project in South Korea and asked exactly the same questions in South Korea that I'm asking in Japan. And you find exactly the same answers. And then you think, well, obviously this phenomenon isn't necessarily unique to Japan. Maybe it's an East Asian phenomenon. Maybe there's something Confucian there. But of course, if you talk to people in South Korea, they don't like that explanation, because they like to see themselves, the academics in South Korea, as part of the global West, because most of the professors at Seoul National and elsewhere have done their PhDs in Western countries, and they want to associate with that. So those become very political types of self-definitions. But take the project that I described at the end about the private universities. It's amazing. If you go to South Korea or if you go to Taiwan, it's exactly the same story. The prediction of these universities disappearing, but they haven't disappeared. So I think you have to do those kind of comparative projects. And I personally have no problem if you wanted to expand that comparison to any parts of the world. I mean, I think you've got to remember what is theory. Theory is a way of helping you think about your data. It's a way of organizing your data. It's a way of trying to put your data into a framework that can help explain what you're looking at, that other people can then use to understand what they're looking at. We have to be careful that we don't over-fetishize what theory is. It's a tool. It shouldn't be more than that. Please.
質問にお答えする前に、やっぱりせっかく横に座ってるわけですから、ちょっと会話をした方が面白いと思うんでこういう会話だけじゃなくてこうも行きたいなと思って、今そのグッドマン先生がおっしゃったことですよね。そのオックスフォードには 50% 以上のアカデミックが世界の各地から来てるっていう話だったんですけども、私がそれを聞いた瞬間に思い出したのはですね、オーストラリアは私も移民ですけども、私の娘3人いまして、ものすごいオーストラリア英語を喋るんですよね。もうなんでそんなになまってるのっていうぐらいのオーストラリア英語を喋るんですよね。で結構周り見てると移民の子っていうのはものすごいわざと強調してるのっていうぐらいにオーストラリア英語を喋る傾向があるな。これ別に研究したわけじゃないですから単なる印象の話ですけども。でなんでこの話をしたかっていうと、外国から来てオックスフォードで職を得てるっていう話だったんですけども、でも結局そのマージナルな人間っていうのはマージナルな人間であればあるほどよりそのノームに従おうとするっていうんですか。だからそのいろんな国から来てるってこと事実自体はですね、その僕が問題視したその方法としての西洋ですよね。West as method というその方法論を使っていないとは言えないわけで、むしろ可能性的にはむしろそれをさらに強化するような研究をしている方の方が多いという可能性もあるわけです。まずちょっと 一つ、コメントをしたかったんですけども、ポストコロニアルの意味ということですか。はい。
この話を例えば CIS って聞いた時比較教育学会のアメリカにあるやつで聞いた時には、そこ自体がノームがあるので分かるんですけども、例えば私自身はそこにおいてかなりペリフェリーなのね。そうすると実はポストコロニアルの話自体をそんなに私自身正直言えば自分の学問的な中心に置いてなくて、自分の目の前にある現実を考えるときに自分に当てはまりそうな国というところで、例えばアジアの国、さっきの言えばその私立大学であれば韓国であったり台湾であったりフィリピンであったりというのを見て、それで結果的にやっぱり同じようにノームにぶつかって、それで対話をするんですけど、少なくとも孤独な気がしないんですね。っていうのはそういうペリフェリーにいる人たちがたくさんいて、ブラジルと日本が結構結託して何かを言ってみたりとかいうことが割と起きてる緩い世界で生きてるので、はい、その時になんていうかここまで高山さんがおっしゃってるように突き詰めなくてもなんとかなっちゃってるというところがあるのが一つあるんです。でただその話をしたかったんじゃなくて、そういうところから見ると実は今おっしゃってるそのポストコロニアルがあんまり多分私だけかもしれないけども、そんなにこの日本の中で共有されてるともちょっとあんま思ってなくて、前提としている概念のいくつかが十分に伝わってないのかなという気がしないでもなくて、その意味で高山先生が今おっしゃってるポストコロニアルってどういうことなのかをもう一回ちょっと基盤としておっしゃっていただいて議論を進めた方が理解が進むかなと思ったというようなことです。
わかりました。こんな勝手に進めちゃっていいですか、こうやって。司会のジャミさん。あ、わかりますか。そうですよね。勝手に話しちゃいけないですよね。そのポストコロニアルっていうのは別にそのコロニアルが終わった、植民地主義が終わったっていうその時代の区分じゃないですよね。そのいわゆる植民地時代に作られた地の構造っていうのが依然として継続しているっていう、それを理解するための視点だと思うんですね。そこであえて私はそのかつての、あまり長い時間過ごすことはできなかった、費やすことはできなかったですけれども、いかにその植民地時代の知識を作るその実践っていうのがその関係ですよね。中心と周辺という関係が、今日においてもかなり継続しているという、そういう意味でのポストコロニアルだったわけですけども、だからその植民地主義が終わったという意味ではないですよね。それがかなり継続しているという。だからコロニアルの時代の状況を今日的にその継続性を理解するという意味でのポストコロニアルですけれども、もう一つ先生がおっしゃったそのリージョナルな東アジアの方々のもうかなり連携が進んでいて、しかもブラジルの方ともですね研究を一緒にやられていて、あまり孤独な感じがしないというおっしゃっていたと思うんですけども、まさしくその話を実はこのトークでもしようと思ってたんですけども、時間がなくなってできなかったんですけども、いかにその日本の教育研究、特にその普遍性といったものに対してですね、実証の他者でもまたは認識の他者としてでもですね、それに物を申すためにはですね、やっぱり日本だけでここから発信しているだけではもうダメだっていうことは、僕は90年代初頭のオリジナル理論を作るってなかなかと私さっき話をしましたけども、あの時の出来事がですねやっぱり証明したんだと思うんです。結局日本特に刈谷野先生の研究なんていうのは理論のその地域性ローカル性というのをすごく明らかにきれいに出した研究なんですよね。でそれも英語で書いてもそれでも全くそれが理論の再考とかに全くつながらなかったっていうのは、やっぱり結局日本はアウトライヤーだからねって終わっちゃうんですよ、日本だけでやってると。だからその意味でもっとポストコロニアルな地の再興の動きっていうのは世界的に起きていて、その運動と結びつけてやらないといけない、そういう意味でもポストコロニアルの視点は大切だと思って言ったわけです。
So let me ask a few of the questions that came for Tobin Sensei. And two of these are quite specific. And let's see, I'll just do three. Two are rather specific, and one is more blue sky, open, theoretical. So let me start with the specific ones. The first question is this idea of the gallery, students watch. Would you say this is something that that is specific to Japanese culture, or did you find a similar thing happening in China as well? That would be the first question. You want to answer each of them as we go? Go ahead. Sure.
Well, I could give both a specific and a more general response to that. I mean, one, in this Teaching Embodied, Hayashi and I write about the gallery, and we could say that it's been described in many cultures, and there's a concept of legitimate peripheral participation and observational learning. So in anthropology, there are notions of, that have been studies in many cultures about how people don't learn only when they are a direct participant in the role of student, but we're learning all the time. And maybe, so that's been pointed out. But I think a more general problem is that I think maybe it's present in all of our talks a little bit is even in this whole notion of Kyoto school, like when you have a theory, whether it's an emic concept like gyarari, or if you're using Watsuji or Kimura, are these theories that come from one place only about that place, or are they more generally theories that could be applied elsewhere? And I don't, or am I? Or I think there's kind of a tension there. So gyarari could be that once we see that concept coming out of this in our Japanese research, we could then go back to China, go back to the US, and look for something we'd missed before. And perhaps there's also peripherally participating children in the other countries. On the other hand, there may be something more specific to the way the concept is playing out in the culture where we first seen it. I'm not sure if that makes sense, or if you guys have thoughts about that. But again, I think maybe it's a question I could ask back to the other panelists, but whether these theories from Japan, are they simultaneously more about theories of Japan or theories from Japan that have no necessary contextual basis in Japan and are just as applicable any place?
例えばそのギャラリーというコンセプトがいわゆるエミックのコンセプトとしますよね。その日本に特有のエミックなコンセプトとして、トービン先生の研究からそう出てくるわけですよね。でそれを今度は外国研究、アメリカの教育でもいいですけども、また全く関係ない韓国でもブラジルでもどこでもいいんですけども、そこの国の教育を理解するのにそれをあえて使うっていうんですか。でそれこそが1991年の園田が提唱した逆欠如論の第一歩なわけですよね。でその中からその新しい外国理解、発見的な外国理解を通してですね、そのギャラリーという概念が今度また日本に戻ってくることで、ある意味こうループができるっていうんですか、認識のループができていくっていう。ということで東部先生、多分先生の次のプロジェクトはこのギャラリーを他の国に当てはめてビデオエスノグラフィーをやるっていうのはいかがでしょうか。
Right, yeah. And to some extent we do that when we show videos made in the US to the Japanese, or we show Japanese videos made in the US, we do attempt to try to have it's not just the researchers who are trying to apply theory, but we try to let the participants in the study try to conceptualize each other's culture.
You want to answer?
Well, I just remembered something that I was told about 30 years ago when I was doing research about the Kikoku Shijo, and it related to the way that bullying operated in different societies. And in fact, it's almost the opposite to the gallery phenomenon, because I remember children told me that one of the things that impressed them when they were bullied in overseas countries, if you can be impressed when you're being bullied, is that it was basically one child would be chosen to have a fight with them, Whereas bullying in Japan, everybody could fight with you at the same time. Lots of other children would attack you at the same time, but when they went to the US or the UK, then the fight would be one child would be selected to fight against them. So it sounds like the gallery would have been existing in the US and UK context. And their view of being at a shogako in Japan was everybody was fighting with them. There wasn't a gallery. I don't know if that's helpful, but I'd never thought about it before. And I guess what that shows is if you introduce a concept like gallery, then you go back and start thinking about things that people told you and think about how does that relate to your ethnographic data that you've got. So it's useful in the sense that it's introducing a new way of looking at your material, which is what I really enjoyed about the example you said, Hayashi-san, was looking back at the old films, not as data, but as if there was a message there, a theory there. It's just a new way of looking at it. And I think that's what any anthropology does. You go and spend time in another society, because it's so much easier to see what is happening elsewhere than it is in your own society. And then you come back, call it whatever you want, call it gallery, call it whatever you want, but you look at your own society differently. I don't think that's theory, though. I think that's just simply opening your eyes to a different way that humans can interact.
Just one other quick comment on the gallery thing is, I think Keita alluded to this. He said he wasn't criticizing, but I think it is an appropriate criticism. Like when there's a tendency when I'm writing, for instance, or with colleagues, with Hayashi or others, about something like gallery in Japan, to idealize it and to just emphasize the more positive features, because it's kind of saying, well, here's something to American readers or Anglophone readers that they maybe should consider and be more aware of the potential to switch their gaze from individuals to the group. But there's also, as you're saying, a tendency then to miss what could be some Japanese people have suggested there's some negative side to the gallery. But then just to bring it back to theory, when we bring in this notion of visibility and seken no me, or the way in which the community it controls itself partly through vision, in Teaching Embodied, we talk a little bit about, but we shouldn't necessarily jump to Foucault's panopticon. Like, how can we talk about something like visibility as both a positive and negative social force, but not quickly assimilate it within Western theories, which have a particular history? But I would just say maybe one other comment about this is, I think across the three talks, we also saw a continuum of how important theory is, or where do you start. And so in Takayama's talk, there's this notion that it's really critical that theory be coming from Japan. And he points out that works by me and others haven't used very much Japanese theory. On the other hand, I don't use very much any theory. I think the question is, and Roger talked about thinking about your theoretical orientation. But I think an interesting tension in all three talks was, what do we do with theory? And does theory lead to raising questions which we then pursue empirically? And I think that's a really good use of theory, but also theory can become a blinder, as you were saying, like if you go in with a certain with a Marxist orientation or a Western theory or Japanese theory, it's going to already, to some extent, determine what you're going to see and what you're going to study.
Great, thank you.
So I have a question for Professor Takayama. When you say Japanese original, do you refer to the Japanese like before modernization that is free from the Western influence, or do you refer to the much more Asian Japan that is free from the like Chinese Confucianism or Indian Mahayana tradition of Buddhism? And that was my first question. And I also want to ask, is that necessary to make an ontological distinction between like Japan and China, or among the countries of East Asia? Like, you can see clearly that from Tobin Sensei's research that there is a clear difference between Japanese preschool and Chinese preschool. But I think also in Professor Rappleye's research, he didn't make like very clear distinction in a type 2 learning, like among the East Asian countries. So do you think that kind of like a ontological distinction on the level of very deep philosophy is necessary?
I might have used the term origin, original theorizing from Japan. Is that what you're referring to? Like origin, the term origin? I think I can think of that's the only place where I use the term origin, original, in my talk.
Yes. Like,
Okay. Yep. No, I think what I meant was really at the early 1990s, group of Japanese sociologists of education were trying to be the agent in knowledge production. They wanted to create a theory that is their own production, right? And they wanted to come up with a theory that is relevant to the particular context of Japanese education. And that's what I mean by original, in a sense that they are the origin of the idea that they're going to use to make sense of Japanese education, as opposed to using theories that are coming from elsewhere, right? So I wasn't really referring to origin in a sense of, is it a reference in reference to before modernization or ancient Japan? To me, that point is a bit irrelevant to the point that I was making. Okay, it's just a clarification. And I think that you made another point I was going to respond, but I tend to forget. So is it necessary to make an ontological distinction between China and Japan, right? I think because I was, that's in reference to Jeremy and Hikaru's work, Komatsu Hikaru's work, right? I mean, Jeremy can probably answer your question, but I would say some level of a generalization, right? In order to make a point that the ontological premise of PISA testing, the notion of self, as it's underpinning the PISA testing, also the theory of learning that's underpinning the PISA, in order to relativize that, what is considered to be universal, you sort of have to engage in some sort of strategic essentialism, in a sense that you quite artificially construct certain general categories in order to argue against what is considered to be universal, right? And I think, Jeremy, I didn't do justice to the complexity and subtlety of his argument, Hikaru and Jeremy's argument. But if you read that piece carefully, I think they makes many moves in the article that suggest that they are highly consciously strategic about the way in which they construct these two categories, type A and type 1 and type 2, right? So maybe Jeremy, you can say something in response to the question.
Give a question to all three of the, I've put together a few questions that came in for different people, but I think we can combine them into a kind of very important underlying thread across all three presentations. And this is the idea of how do we surface assumptions? How do we surface implicit assumptions? I think, the simple question is, how do we do it? Do you have examples? Do you have thoughts about how to do it? It appeared to me, and this wasn't written in the questions, but that you each did it in a very different way, empirically. Professor Takayama was reading works that had been written and looking at it, maybe also from his experience in Australia or the United States. And Professor Goodman, 2 points in time and looking at the ways that those assumptions didn't hold in one society. So if you could comment on surfacing the assumptions, because it's really at the core of this project, I think.
So there was a fashion, particularly in the 1990s, for what was called reflexive anthropology or reflexive sociology, linked to certain ideas in postmodern thinking that everything we wrote was nothing more than a reflection of our own assumptions. And people began to write accounts of other societies that were actually accounts of themselves. So I can remember reading some accounts, some ethnographies, where the first 50 pages would be about their own personal background and all the things that they brought to the study, about the influence of how old they were and their gender. Sexuality was often an important part of this. Nationality, all kinds of issues that they would bring to the fore, which they said you needed to understand about them, so you could then understand the way they were looking at the society they were studying, say it was Japan, and then you could judge their analysis of, say, Japan against the background of what you knew about them. So they were the research tool, they were writing about Japan, you needed to understand the research tool to understand what they wrote about Japan. That was a very popular and sometimes rather, in my view, rather tedious exercise that was really just overplayed. And some of it, I mean, let me be honest, some of it could have been interesting, but wasn't. I mean, what could have been interesting would have been if people had looked at what they thought was the impact of, say, their national background, their national identity on the way they study Japan. I took part in a very interesting experiment in the late 1980s, run by, people may remember Befu Harumi, who is a very well-known anthropologist based at Stanford. And Befu Sensei invited 8 people who were interested in Japan to go and stay in a hotel in Tokyo. He more or less locked us into this hotel for a week. And he invited 8 Japanese specialists on our countries also to go. They were also locked in for a week. And we had to discuss what we thought was the main influence of the way we looked at Japan from our national background. And the Japanese scholars had to do the same, looking at us from the outside. And that was very interesting because there was a Korean scholar who, for them, the key looking at Japan was about kinship. There was a scholar from Russia, this was before 1989. For them, it was about capitalism. There was a scholar from Germany, it was about liberal democracy. There was a scholar from the States, it was Robert Smith. For him, it was ethnicity, race. The core variable in America is race. And of course, because I was British, it was easy, it was class. Because everything in Britain is about class. And of course, that's true. All my research has become a class analysis of Japan because that's the framework that I bring. I can't look at the world in any different way. So I probably should have talked about that. But the one thing I have never, ever seen anybody think about or write about reflexively is what are their theoretical assumptions about the relationship between the person and society. And that's why I gave the talk today, because I think we can understand a lot of research if we can understand that particular concept. So I was less interested about their age and their gender and all those other things. I'd be much more interested about their theoretical assumptions. Now, we can work those out normally through 2 ways. The first thing I do when I read a book in Japan, the first thing I do is look at the acknowledgements and see who they have put down as the people they rely on. The second thing I look at is the bibliography. And that also gives me an indication of the type of people that they are drawing on to create their account of Japan. And then I read the book. But I shouldn't have to do that. They should be sufficiently self-aware that they should tell me at the beginning of the book what were those assumptions that they were taking when they were doing that account. And the thing that slightly puzzled me this afternoon is we're using theory in 2 different ways. I'm talking about theoretical assumptions, the way that we think about the world, which means that we then look at something through a particular framework. I think Keita, you're talking about bringing theory out of our data. What theories can we develop out of our data? Now, there is a circular part of this, of course. The more we look at something, the more we develop a way of thinking about it, then the more we use that for looking again. But I think we need to be clear when we talk about theory, which part of that cycle we're actually using. I'm talking about assumptions. We all have them. We all think about the person in a certain way. And we all think about society in a certain way, but we need to reflect on that before we start describing and talking about other societies.
アサンプションをいかにこう意識化するっていう話ですよね。実は私あれだけ長くお話をさせていただいたんですけども、まだ3分の1ぐらい内容が残っていたんですね。でその辺の話をしようかと思ってたんですけども、時間がなくなってできなくなりました。その中でですね、私は溝口雄三の本当は話をすごく深くしたかったんですけども、その中で溝口雄三さんが方法としての中国っていう概念を提示されていて、でその概念が、台湾のクワンシン・チェンっていう方が英語でAsia as Method って本を書かれて、でその後に孫家さんっていう、これは中国の社会科学の研究者ですけども、その方が同じようなことを、おっしゃってるんですね。その方法としてのアジアっていう、つまりその中国研究を超えた中国研究をするっていうことですね。その常に、自分自身を恒常的な越境状態に置くっていう言葉を使われるんですけども、その常にそのいくつもの参与点を持つというレファレンスポイントをいくつも作っていくっていう、これはクワンシン・チェンさんがおっしゃってることですけども、そうすることで常に、自分の主体とかですね、自分の持っているアサンプションといったものを常にそれを相対化する機会を作り出すっていうのは、その鍵となる概念っていうのは結構、溝口さんとか、孫家さんとかチェンさん、東アジアの研究者の方、知識人の方から私は多くのことを学んだというふうに思っています。実はその辺の方々の著作を、ベースにしてですね、方法としての日本という概念を、提示したかったんですけども、それはまた別の機会でお話しできたらと思います。
The way I think of research is that the point is to say something new to an ongoing conversation. And so I think it's more about effects than intentions. The question for me is like, what does reading this piece of research, how can it lead to someone leaving? After having read it, will they now have some new understanding that they wouldn't have had before? And so I think you could take theory, like these days I've been interested for the first time, partly because Jeremy's been sending it to me, been reading some of the Kyoto school theory, and I find it's useful, having read it, then I could then go back to Yochian or Hoikuan with different questions and different eyes and maybe see something different than I would have before. On the other hand, I guess I'm just saying something I said before. If you go in with too much theory, instead of seeing something new, you'll just end up seeing what the theory would direct you to see. So if you go in with Foucault, you'll end up seeing a panopticism. And so for me, the tension is how do we use theory rather than being used by theory, so that we can somehow be present in a new way that could allow us to see something new that we could then communicate.
That reminds me of a very nice example. You showed a slide of Imanishi sensei, the primatologist. Was that you? No, you showed the slide of Imanishi sensei. So that reminds me of some very interesting research. So Imanishi sensei he worked on monkeys in Arashiyama. I think there's a big monkey troop in Arashiyama in Kyoto. Some of you may know this story, but in the 1960s, that monkey troop got too big and they were beginning to come and down into the city and they were causing problems. So a large part of the monkey troop was taken to Texas. Do people know this story? And they were put in a site in Texas. And they were studied by primatologists in Texas. So they were genetically the same monkey group. There were some in Arashiyama and there were some in Texas. And a very brilliant young primatologist called Pamela Asquith decided, she had a brilliant idea. She brought together after about 20 years of the research happening in Kyoto and in Texas, she brought together the researchers, the primatologists, to get them to compare the research that they were doing on this monkey, or the monkeys. They were genetically the same monkeys. And what she discovered that the Japanese primatology research was all about how the monkeys were working together and about cooperation and the group and how they were passing on knowledge, whereas all the research done by the American primatologists was about hierarchy, about strength, about boundaries. And she just said it was interesting because these were the same monkeys, but they were starting with totally different assumptions about the world. And they were looking at these monkey troops through their view of what society should look like. And I think we do that all the time, okay? I mean, it's no coincidence that Darwinian theory came out of Victorian Britain, because Britain at that time was the greatest country and it needed a theory to prove why it was the greatest country. I mean, all of these theories have a social context. The worrying thing is we don't often express that or think that. I should say, I think the primatologists were very unhappy with Pamela Asquith because they thought they were objectively looking at the monkeys rather than that they were imposing their own anthropomorphic worldview onto the monkeys. But we do this all the time. I can only look at Japan as a class society because I'm British. It's a problem, but it's a fact.
Lots of things to talk about. I thought I'd ask Roger the question about the very bad predictions made by those three areas of Kikoku Shijo, private universities, and child abuse. Isn't it true that social scientists are pretty bad at prediction in general? And part of the reason for that is social science gets out into the general world and actors act upon what they learn. And so, for example, the private universities, they would have been reading all those books about the prediction of the collapse of private universities. So there's inevitably going to be a kind of feedback loop of that kind. And actually, it's nothing to be ashamed of if social scientists are very bad prediction. It's probably safer if they don't predict too carefully. I mean, I predicted in my the end of my teachers' union book that the direction taken by the more moderate half of the union was a good move to make. But I didn't predict the total collapse of the opposition to the LDP when I was making that prediction. And so now the teachers' union are very, very weak. And so that prediction is looking rather silly. But the grounds that I made it on at the time were based on evidence at the time. And some of the things you were talking about in the case of Kikoku Shijo private universities, those are perfectly good assumptions and good observations. So Kikoku Shijo coming back to Japanese education system do have trouble adapting back. And I think there still is largely an attitude of a zero-sum game in the sense if a child is too long outside Japan, their Japaneseness does go down. Now that has probably been modified by what you were talking about, the future opportunities for Kikoku Shijo or other Ryugakusei are much more clear now than they were in the 80s probably. But the problems they may face, certainly in certain kinds of school, they haven't gone away. And the private university, I think the predictions about bankruptcy, to be fair to those predictions, a lot of those bankruptcies have probably been covered up. To be totally, I actually know a couple of cases of, or maybe covered up is too strong a word, but a very, very unprofitable four-year university, which is being heavily subsidized by the other parts of the Gakuen, just because of the prestige of keeping that four-year university. And so they have avoided all the catastrophic bankruptcies of 300 universities going bankrupt. That hasn't happened. But the basic structural problems and the demographic problems, they were accurate when the people said that. So social scientists are bad at predicting, but that's not necessarily a problem.
So my point was a slightly different one. I have no problem about social sciences making predictions. I have no problem about them being completely wrong about the predictions. But for me, the interesting thing is, why don't they go back and look at the predictions and try and work out with the basis of more evidence about why they were wrong? That's the point I'm trying to make. And normally the reason that they were wrong is because they were working in a certain paradigm with a certain set of assumptions. And then it's quite interesting to try to figure, when you've moved into a new paradigm, well, what were those assumptions and why did we think like that at that time? So I just think it's an intellectually good exercise for social scientists to engage in, is to go back and look at earlier work that they did. This is why I really like this diachronic approach, because that's exactly what Joe and his team are doing. They're going back and looking at the same data. But we don't do that. I mean, to be honest, we collect too much data and we don't analyze most of it. We all know that, because collecting data is the easy bit. And analysis is the difficult bit. So we just keep collecting more data. We all have far too much data. But data from 1985 is still interesting and is still important. And I love the idea of the same teacher looking at the same class with the same age group. Was it 20 years apart? 13. It's just brilliant. And getting them to reflect on their own practice and so on. But we don't do that very often. We just ignore the old data. And so that's why I was surprised. I mean, the reason I started this project, if you want to know, is because I had, this is Ota-san's book, where I was sent that, and I thought about the problem for private universities that came out last year. And I thought, I've read this book before. In fact, I've read this book many, many times. I read this book in 2003 and 4. And then I went back and discovered there were tens of books written then. But there's no mention about that. It's like it never happened. And I'm thinking, well, what a shame as a social scientist. What a great project. Let's go back and see, why did people think that then? And what did happen? And I'm sure there are many universities that are being looked after by the attached senior high schools and Seimongako. But why didn't they see that then? Why didn't they think that that was what was going to happen? Because you can't allow the flagship university to collapse. So what was the framework that didn't allow them to see what was going on then? That's all I'm really saying. It's just a great social science exercise to go back and see why you made predictions and why they were wrong.
Yeah, I quite agree with that. I think part of the work that we can do just to pick up on that, some of the work that the Global Office can do is to reflect on previous attempts, successful or not, to do a similar type of work. And that itself is such an instructive exercise. So really appreciate it. Maybe time for one more question? One or two more questions, depending on the length.
And your talks are very full of inspiring ideas. And now we are starting the project, but myself have two difficulties. One is that there is diversity in Japan, and I sometimes feel that diversity in Japan is bigger than differences between Japan and other countries. So it is very difficult for me to imagine Japanese model. So I would like to receive any advice from you. Another difficulty is that I cannot really imagine what kind of audience would be interested in our result. I'm rather pessimistic because I used to study in the University of Birmingham, and there were a variety of people from abroad. And of course, we had interesting discussion as friends. But apart from that friendship, I couldn't imagine the audience who are seriously need information of Japanese education. So I would like to know what's the possibility of the impact of the outcome of the project. Professor Takayama suggested that if we produce powerful theory which totally changes the European theory, that would have impact. But at the moment, I cannot really imagine that kind of theory. So I would appreciate any advice. Sorry.
All right. Okay, I'll start off. Yeah. Okay. I think it's a fundamental question that I think we need to get this question right for the Global Education Office, isn't it? It's a fundamental question. I think we have to have a perfect answer for that question, right? So the first point, I think, as I understand, is that there's an enormous diversity within Japan. So what's the point of something distinct? What's the point of recognizing something distinctive about Japanese education? And then the second part of the question was, is there any actual interest outside Japan in Japanese education? I think one of the points I made was this intra-societal diversity and inter-societal diversity. 国内の多様性と国際的な多様性ですよね。So there's an always tension. And I think Japanese researchers tend to look at overall the politics of difference within the nation state. And then international scholars like Joe, for example, look at Japan as a unit of analysis, as a meaningful unit of analysis, right? So there's an assumption, I guess this is going back to the discussion around assumption. The assumption that international scholars are making is that it is meaningful to look at Japan as a unit of analysis, right? There's something interesting going on in Japan that needs to be talked about. Then on the other hand, Japanese folks are saying, well, we're more interested in the politics of difference within Japan. So there's a considerable difference in the way people outside Japan and inside Japan talk about Japanese education. And oftentimes there's a glaring gap, almost discommunication between folks inside and outside Japan. So there's so much negativities about Japanese education within Japan. No one seems to be talking positively about Japanese education. But if you look at any international literature, of course it's declining, but still there. But many of them, for example, Joe's work, it's quite positive, right? And it's actually quite surprising to many of the Japanese scholars to read the positive account of Japanese education. So I guess going back to the discussion around assumption, looking at international scholarship on Japanese education allows us to perhaps start recognizing a nation state as a meaningful unit of analysis. I know there's a whole discussion around methodological nationalism and critique of it. But given this circumstance where in Japan, everyone seems to be so negative about Japan, perhaps it's time to recognize nation state as a meaningful unit of analysis and then learn from international scholarship. Although, as I said in my talk, there are many issues that needs to be worked out. So that's my response to the first question. Then I'll pass it on to someone else.
So there are two reasons maybe you're worried about why people might not be interested. Partly a fear that the outside world has lost interest in Japan, what is sometimes called Japan passing. And this is normally related to the idea that you can only be interested in one East Asian country at a time, and China has to be that country at the minute, and therefore there's no room to be interested in Japan. This is a tragedy and a crazy idea. But there's some truth in that. Certainly in my country, there's an absolute fixation of China, which is bizarre because Japanese investment in the UK is massive. There is no Chinese investment in the UK, but still there is the idea that China is of interest and Japan isn't. The other reason I'm afraid is that people in Japan think Japan is not interesting. So people themselves in Japan don't think that they have an interesting story to tell. You have an amazing story to tell. Japan is still one of the great powerhouses in the world. It's still the third largest economy. Some people say maybe still the second largest, depending on how you measure these things. You still have probably the most highly educated population the world has ever seen. Okay, so Finland does better in PISA. Finland has got 2.5 million people. Japan is a big country which has an amazingly highly educated population. Hugely impressive figures on all kinds of areas of social performance and so on. So Japan has a really important story. Please don't be so modest about what you can tell. You tell the story, and then it's our job in other countries to pick up that story and to run with it. I think this is a really important project. And, you know, of course there's diversity in Japan, but one of the strengths of Japan is a belief that you're only as good as your weakest section, your weakest part of society. So Japan is a society which invests at the bottom end. It tries not to have a tail. That in itself is an incredible story that the world needs to know about. So please be less modest. Can I assure you that this is really an important project, and we're looking forward to the results. So please work hard at it.
I think this question of variation within a nation state is really an interesting one. But what in my own work, what I've tried to show is, yes, there's lots of variation in Japanese early childhood ed, and there's variation in US and in China, but the variation isn't the same in all three. So even what differs and what people argue about is also, in a sense, characteristic of the nation. So the fact that there's variation, I don't think means so there's nothing interesting to say about Japan because there's too much variation. I would want to know, so what are the areas where there's variation? Which also means there are areas maybe that aren't varied. But I've always put the problem back onto the people I study and ask them, so what are you guys disagreeing about? Or what are you worried about? And I think that's very interesting. A confession, going off Roger's point, in 1989 we published Preschool in Three Cultures at a time when Japan was #1 and there was this immense interest in Japan. So it's called Preschool in Three Cultures, Japan, China, and the US. In 2009, we did Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited, China, Japan, and the US. So there is some kind of marketing issue, but still, China had changed so much that was the big story. But what we wrote is, change is sexier than continuity, and success is kind of more attractive than failure. So there is an audience more for stories of who's succeeding and who's changing. But what we wrote in the book is, actually continuity is really interesting too. And it takes more, it's like to stand in a fast-moving stream and not change takes more energy than to go with the flow. So I think, we have to fight against, even when things seem to be just kind of stagnating, that's interesting in itself. And then the other thing I'd say is, yeah, there's less interest in America right now in Japan, but I think there's a story we're not telling, which would be compelling. When we did the interviews in 1984, Americans were interested in Japan, but Japan had a more positive self-image, and so we were hearing more positive stories. When we went back 20 years later, a lot of the early childhood people we talked to had a sense of like, we blew it, like our time has passed. Parents are getting worse, teachers are getting worse. But that narrative of kind of arrived at the postmodern moment and it turned out we blew it is one that I think resonates with a lot of other countries. So Japan, the fact that Japan seems to no longer have that energy of about to do something great is actually an interesting story to tell. And I think other countries are feeling a similar sense of pessimism and kind of exhaustion. So just kind of to compare these kind of cynical, pessimistic stories about things we no longer have this ability we once had to feel optimistic and in control, I think can be compelling if we start telling it in the right way.
Great. I think those were great final comments from all three panelists. We're going to close the panel discussion, and before I do that, I'd just like to give them a round of applause for their speeches and also the response.